Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining me on another episode of the Diary of a CMO. Today, I have a very special guest to have conversations with. I do not take these opportunities lightly in terms of being able to have conversations with these amazing people, just based off of the things that they have done in their career professionally. Today is not any different. I'm so happy to welcome to the show Luca Gallarelli. He is the group CEO of TBWA South Africa. It's a multidisciplinary group of agencies spanning the specialist to the integrated spectrum. Over the last 21 years, he has led complex multidisciplinary teams, honing a natural ability to drive growth through organizational cohesion. I'm so honored to have on the pod with me, Luca. Thank you very much for joining me today, Luca.
It's a pleasure, Charles. Thank you very, very much for having me. And well done on the surname. There was a little wry smile on my side because all of the L's can often trick you up. So well done, you nailed it.
I
Thank you for having
appreciate
me.
that. Typically, before I hit record, I would, try to pronounce it so that you correct me offline. This time around, somehow I slipped. I slipped up. So I'm
Well,
happy
well
I
done.
did
You got
well
it. You had one
regardless.
shot and you got it right.
I appreciate that, Luca. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. I do not take it lightly at all. I think I said this earlier to you before pressing record, and I'm really excited for the conversations that we're going to have today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Great stuff. So I typically like to start by saying that for those who are meeting you for the first time, how would you like to introduce yourself to them in a way that captures a bit of your your professional journey?
Okay, perfect. So let me start. So I'll give you just a little bit of a sense of who I am, sort of as a person and where I'm from, because I think so much of
I love that.
my
I love
journey,
that.
my journey
I love that.
professionally is kind of informed a little bit by that.
I
So
love that.
I'm Luca Gallarelli, as you say, and I was born in 1978 in a small eastern city in South Africa, which went then by the name of Port Elizabeth, Gqeberha, as it stands today, about 750 kilometers further east of Cape Town, and spent my youth, my entire schooling career and university career in the city itself. Born to two veins of immigrant stock into South Africa. My father was a first generation South African, having moved to South Africa in the the mid 1960s from Italy, and my mother having been born in in Port Elizabeth in 1950. So and my mother's Greek, right? So Italian father, Greek mother.
Wow.
Growing up in a small city, sort of very connected to. If anybody knows anything about communities, particularly ones where faith is so sort of central to them, growing up as part of the Greek community, the Greek Orthodox Church is sort of central to culture. And within a small city like Port Elizabeth, with big immigrant populations moving in, was very, very close to the Jewish community in Port Elizabeth because the main Jewish shul was right next door to the main Orthodox Church. So they formed sort of part of one broader community. So I was despite being an Italian of Greek Orthodox faith, I grew up as part of a broader sort of Jewish community in the small city. And I think, why I mention all of that stuff is that, this idea of different perspectives and melting pot that makes up what South Africa is and what Africa is something actually that even as my own identity was formed growing up is something so, I suppose, fundamental to who I am. I grew up, you could say, as part of, by proxy, sort of an artistic household. My father had been a hairdresser when we left school when he was 13 years old and became a hairdresser in Rome before moving to South Africa and establishing a few of his salons. And my mother was a fine artist. So this idea of being in an environment that was stimulated by creativity and in different realms, but two areas specifically, one often doesn't think of um, jobs or careers such as hairdressing as being fundamentally creative. But I certainly always felt that when I was in his space and within his salons and surrounded by the people that he worked with, and then certainly my mother's circle of friends. So this idea and this pull towards the creative industries has been, as I said, so fundamental to who I am, and so much of how I choose to navigate life personally through life and through career is so heavily informed by, I suppose, my personal upbringing and the space that I was given as a child to navigate.
Wow, amazing. I I find it really interesting, and I'm about to have a conversation that um, I'm, I like to have, because for me, I always like to say that, I mean, just like when you were trying to introduce yourself just now,
Mm,
that sort of personal perspective to this professional career,
mm,
it's to be
mm,
honest with you, more important to me than the actual professional one itself.
mm,
So I just wanted to ask you, like, looking at the history of South Africa, yeah,
mm,
and having like a first generation father, and your
mm,
mom with her own sort of background as well. What
mm,
was that like growing up in South Africa? Again, maybe not
mm,
for you, but at least for them living in South Africa as immigrants. What was that like
mm,
in those times? And if you had any
mm,
childhood experiences that capture, some of the challenges and the nuance of this
mm,
cultural diversity, specifically for the South
mm,
African market, you could please share that
mm.
as well.
Yeah, so in terms of my personal experience, growing up in South Africa, the product of um, Greek and Italian immigrants, there was no. I would be lying if I said there was any adversity that
Interesting.
confronted us. Right.
Interesting.
Um,
Interesting.
as I said, we were very entrenched within our respective communities, the Greek community, and my father, just by virtue of having lived a very social life within his job, we're very very much a part of Port Elizabeth society, I suppose. I
Right.
was educated at a fairly prominent school within Port Elizabeth, which was, you know, quite diverse as it could, as in as much as it could have been diverse back in those days. There were a
Yeah.
lot of Jewish
Yeah.
kids at the school. There were a lot of kids from immigrant stock. There weren't particularly that many Afrikaans kids, but there were a lot of boys that came from, I suppose, more British extraction. So, I always felt, certainly within a city like Port Elizabeth, it provided the best possible environment for my upbringing,
Fantastic.
and we certainly
Fantastic.
benefited from all of the opportunities that were afforded to us at the time. Uh,
Got it. Got
but
it.
I think, as I said, around sort of being a part of with growing up within a creative environment, how one ends up sort of, you leapfrog from that into sort of professional life. Sometimes these transitions aren't as deliberate or um, as deliberate as one would imagine. Very often they're the result of a series of many small decisions that were made along the way that end up carrying you to the place where hopefully you believe you've always meant to be, if that makes sense, right? So,
Yeah.
when I look
Yeah.
back through my childhood, as it relates to what I believe, some of the skills that I've acquired along the way through my time at school, as probably not the best scholar in the world, but I'm somebody that took in as many sort of life experiences as I possibly could, to my sort of a few missteps after school through tertiary
Right.
education before kind of finding my place, and
Right.
then all of a sudden that galvanizing and being kind of giving me an immense sense of purpose and direction as it relates to my career. I wish I could say it was a straight line. It is as zigzag as one can ever
Yeah.
imagine. But I feel
Yeah.
immensely grateful for the opportunities.
Yeah. I think the zigzag is pretty common for a lot of people as well. Just not being
Mm.
having that level of clarity very early on in terms of, what
Yeah,
direction I want to go with this. But it makes the ride more exciting, doesn't it? It makes the ride more exciting. Um,
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I would never have, some kids when you're at school, and I often reflect on this with one of my very close personal friends from school is a teacher at my son's school. Um, no, so it's very, and he's actually his teacher in grade 6, and it's because you still have this relationship with yourself as a child. You still think you're this youngster, and you think of teachers as these wise elders, and here's somebody who's my age, sort of looking after my child. But sort of why I go there is I remember him from my early days at school when I first met him. Must have been what is now grade 3, and he always had such clarity on what he wanted to do with his life. When you're in grade 3, what do you want to do when you're old? And some boys, if I was at an all boys school, so excuse the reference to some boys, that's just my frame of reference. And some boys would, if their dads were lawyers or doctors, they'd be like, I want to be a lawyer like my dad. I want to be a doctor like my dad. Some boys are very, I want to still be a fireman or a policeman or an astronaut. And some, have an immense sense of clarity. And this chap decided way back then that he wanted to be a teacher. And I often relay that story to him, that he had this deep sense of, direction from such a young age that
wow,
that informed all of his decisions through the rest of his life
wow,
to get him to exactly where he is now. And
wow.
I sit back and I reflect on how different that is from my experience, but how
Right.
wonderfully unique each is, and how two can,
Yeah.
a straight line to where you're meant to
Yeah.
be, and a
Yeah.
zigzag line to where you're meant to be.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Amazing.
yeah,
Amazing. Amazing. Let's take it into your professional sort of
mm,
journey so far now. It appears like,
yeah.
if I have my numbers right, it's like you have been in the industry for probably over 25 years now.
Close on that. Close on that.
Right,
Yeah.
right. Yeah, I try to do a rough maths. And it appears that very early on you've had the opportunity to occupy leadership positions. I think that whether it's from Ogilvy or anything before then, just
Mm,
kind of take us on that trajectory for you.
sure.
Like, what was that like?
Sure. 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 Um, Probably, the best way, and again, sorry, I often talk in narratives, so forgive me if
No
I
worries,
weave a little
no worries.
story. I decided when I was at school that as I mentioned, that I wanted to be, that I was sort of grew up in a creative environment, that I wanted to work in a creative environment, but I didn't know what that looked like. I had no exposure to the advertising industry through my high school career. So I thought that the only way into um, and the world of advertising, so to speak, was through the creative sphere. So
Right,
I, very soon after school decided that I wanted to work as a creative person within an advertising agency, uh, having some level of demonstrated some aptitude towards creativity. Let me put it that way through my school career. But I realized very soon on that I just didn't have the level of talent required, or certainly the level of talent that I was surrounded by. Certainly, I was self-assessing myself relative to my peers at what was then art college, design college in Port Elizabeth. So I left after 2-3 months. I dropped out and spent pretty much a year and a half trying to work out what I wanted to do, because I thought that this career in advertising was going to be for me, and it was I don't want to say devastating, but it was quite derailing to feel like
right,
everything you've
right,
invested in, actually
right,
this may not be the space for you.
right.
So I spent a year and a half doing odd jobs around the city and working in a computer shop and working as a waiter, until eventually going to university to do what a lot of confused kids at the time did, which is just a sort of a straight BCom computer science. Um, and and my parents, I was in the fortunate position that my parents indulged me. And after 3 years of doing that, I had a friend who came to advertising college in Cape Town. And he said to me, you know what, Luca, like there's a whole commercial side to advertising. You don't have to
Wow,
be
wow,
an art director or a copywriter. You can work on the commercial side, and you should consider doing a
wow.
postgrad course in Cape Town. again, after now my parents had really indulged me, I sat them down and suggested that I go to Cape Town for a year at advertising college to do this post-grad course. And I just remember my dad said to me at the time that he'd never benefited from education. As I mentioned, I think he'd left school when he was 13 years old.
Yeah.
He just said, no year spent studying will ever be a year wasted. So you go with my blessing. And it was in that year at what was the AAA school, what is still the AAA school now, that I found my place. You know, all of these disparate bits of information through growing up in a creative environment, thinking I had the creative aptitude to then going into computer science, which is sort of applied creativity through sort of logic, I would say, but I would maintain an immense amount of creativity exists in solving business problems through the application of coding, so to speak.
Right.
They all it all clicked for me in that year. So what I had was, coming into my first job at Ogilvy, was a deep sense of I found my place, which I was very grateful for, and a restlessness that I now felt like I'd wasted 2 years. You know, despite having arrived at a place where I had clarity, I felt like the time that I'd spent after school was 2 years wasted. And that just was an emotional response to it, because I would never have arrived at the destination had I not gone through that. But there was a feeling of restlessness, and that I needed to achieve quickly. So I had very quickly set myself a series of short-term goals, and with thinking about what the long-term goal would be. And for me, it was always, I wanted to achieve two things when I joined Ogilvy. The first was to become a director by the time I was 30. And the second was to be managing director of that agency at Ogilvy and Mayfair in Cape Town. And then it was all about a series of short-term achievements. It was, I need to be moved from account executive as a real baby to account manager. Right. I want to be the best. In order to do that, I must be the best account executive in this agency. In order to move from account manager to account director, I must be the best account manager in this agency. And it was through, I suppose, those short-term goals that saw me, to a large extent, achieve all of the goals that I'd set out for myself within the world of Ogilvy. Certainly as it was set at that stage. When you become managing director, when it's become your ambition for such a long period of time, then you find yourself going, oh goodness, I've spent 10 years trying to achieve this. I've done it. Now what is my next ambition? And then you sit around scratching your head a little bit, and maybe emotionally find myself a little back in that first and second year after school, going, now what? Right. But I think, that by and large has been the energy with which I've approached my career at every step, whether it's at Ogilvy. I had a 2.5-year stint at Jupiter Drawing Room in Cape Town, which was 2.5 of the most formative, fun years I've ever had within advertising before going back to Ogilvy. And then, 5 and a bit years ago, I got a phone call to come and chat to the chaps at TBWA South Africa. And again, instinctively, after 5 minutes in the room with the people that would become my colleagues, I knew that I needed to be in this place. That, again, whatever power was in control of ensuring that I was in that room, I knew that I was where I needed to be. And that very often has been my approach, right? It is a combination of some very sort of rational, logical moves, and sort of living with ideas and thoughts for a very, very long time. But then it's more, for me, it's about applying that, right? It's not, I don't overthink the answer. I overthink the inputs, and then I let the answer emerge. I trust my gut and my stomach on a lot of these things.
Wow. That's such an interesting story in terms of, that growth and the trajectory. I like the point you were making around, this sort of obsession to be the best. If I want to move from account executive to account manager, I have to be the best here. I want to move from that to this after the best year. This sort of obsession, for healthy obsession for being the best. I absolutely love it. I'm a stickler for excellence as well, because I think that
Awesome.
it's one of the things that separates you from the bunch, if you get what I mean. Like
Yeah.
I think everyone is comfortable. Most people, not everyone, most people are comfortable with doing the bare minimum or just enough or just pushing the envelope a little bit.
Yeah.
But I think that the more you push that boundary of excellence, of being the best, I think that truly is what separates you from the bunch. And it's no surprise that you are where you are today for me.
Well, that's very kind. I think
Yeah.
it's probably informed by two things for me personally. The first is
Mm,
I've always been sort of naturally quite competitive, and that's a bit of a double-edged sword, right?
mm,
It's
mm.
if an innate sense of competitiveness can be synthesized and harnessed in a way that is, I suppose, progressive in the sense that it
Right,
moves you forward. I think
right.
that it's a really good thing. It can also, competitiveness can also result in a whole host of not so healthy kinds of behaviors, right? So
Yeah,
when I was a
yeah.
child, I was very, very competitive in the sports that I played, and I used to be an absolute misery on the tennis court or on the golf course, much to the embarrassment of my father, because that competitiveness sort of played itself out in like not so good behaviors. Like I was like a
Right.
petulant child. But
Wow.
as you grow up and as you navigate life, you learn how to synthesize those things. And so competitiveness on the one side, and then on the other side, like a also this deep sense of um, insecurity that it's
Mm,
all going to sort of come falling down. And in order to do your best to prevent it from falling down, is you really need to put the work in,
wow. Wow.
and to put the work in not only to the business but into the people and into
Yeah,
yourself,
yeah,
in order to ensure that whatever it is you've created is something that is sustainable, not just for
yeah,
yourself, but for the
yeah.
environment that you operate in. So I suppose for me, that's probably those two things. And then
And-
maybe a third, actually, now that we're sort of just
Okay.
reflecting on it, there is a bit of a sense of responsibility to my parents, those that have
Mm,
enabled this, that,
got it.
those that
Got
sacrifice
it.
so much to give
Got it.
one the
Got it.
opportunity to go to a good school, to grow up in a brilliant environment. When you're growing up, you're not aware of what they're giving up
Yeah,
in order to enable that, right? You
yeah,
just
yeah,
you just benefit from it.
yeah.
And I think for me, and probably for my sister too, we probably both have this deep sense of responsibility to paying it back through effort and achievement.
Interesting. That's amazing. That's an amazing reason, if you get what I mean. I think it's really beautiful. I'm
Mm,
sure
thank
that
you.
I'm sure that when they look at you now, I'm sure they're proud of the man that you have becoming or are becoming.
Thank you. Thank you.
Just based off my conversation with you. Let's get into the advertising, the geeky
Yes,
stuff
let's
now.
do it. Perfect.
Even though for me, these first like part of the podcast is typically my favorite, but I also know that
Yeah.
people want to sort of pick your mind and pick your brain off of the things that you can share.
Perfect.
I think the
Perfect.
first
Perfect.
conversation I wanted to have with you is regarding the South African creative industry.
Hmm.
I think that I think on the continent, in terms of like market and leadership, in terms of the continent now, Africa. Obviously, South Africa sits at the top of that, tree or ladder or whatever. And for you as well, you've had the opportunity to work with some of the largest and the best agencies in South Africa. I was
Hmm.
wondering how you would describe, this sort of unique creative voice or identity, that South African agencies bring to the global stage. What is it about South Africa or South African agencies that really, drives this sort of unique creative voice or
Hmm.
identity that they bring to play? I have friends who run, agencies or some boutique shops in Nigeria, and they always talk about the fact that, man, I need to go to SA and just do internship in maybe
Mhm.
TBWA or Joe Public or King
Mm,
James or whatever,
mm,
. So I'm just curious, what do you think is that? What do you think is the source? Is it the air you guys breathe there? Is it like what do you think?
mm.
What do you think is the source?
No, I mean it's a very good question, and you probably find that if you ask 10 people that same question, you may get 10 different answers. All right. But I think for me, it's probably about two things more so than anything else. The first is about ambition. I think that as South Africans, there is a deep sense of ambition to show the world what we're capable of doing and what we're capable of achieving. Um, I think that our geographical location in the world can often lead to a sense of being a little bit isolated, and being a little bit cut off. So, we often feel like we need to sort of remind people that we're here. And it's through that desire to remind people that often that sort of manifests in um, producing work that gets noticed, doing things that achieves outcomes that gain recognition, um, and certainly setting the bar very, very high for what that looks like, right?
Mm,
So I think, I've been very fortunate to have worked with those three agencies that I mentioned: Ogilvy, Jupiter Drawing Room, and TBWA South Africa, all three of which have their genesis in local creative agencies. In the case of Ogilvy, it was Rightford, Siltrip and Make, and Jupiter Drawing Room, it wasn't independent for so long, and then
right.
TBWA South Africa within Hunt Lascaris. These are all agencies that were founded on a premise of wanting to bring South African creativity to the world.
Wow.
Right. So very, very ambitious, and not setting themselves against a standard that was possibly held in South Africa, but upholding the quality of their thinking and the quality of their work to a fundamentally global standard.
Mm,
So I think that's probably the first thing, because I'm a big believer in, personally, and again, I'm sculpted by the environments that I've grown up in, but I am a big believer in dreaming big. There's no point in dreaming medium or dreaming small, right? If it's a dream, it's meant to be big. And once you are deliberate with a statement of ambition or a statement of intent, it governs all of your decisions downstream of that. I used that silly story about me coming into Ogilvy and wanting to be managing director. Um, for me, all the decisions I made from the day one were geared
mm,
towards achieving that goal, right? So,
right.
as a creative industry in South Africa, if we say we want TBWA South Africa to be the best creative agency in the world, that
Mm,
sets a different framework
mm.
for
Yeah,
how
yeah,
you
yeah,
approach everything:
yeah,
how you
yeah,
recruit, the kind of
yeah,
culture you want to create,
yeah,
how you
yeah,
evaluate your work, the kinds of
yeah.
clients you wish to attract. It
Right,
governs absolutely everything. So I think
right,
ambition is the first thing. I
right.
think the second thing is that we've grown up in a fundamentally diverse, yet deeply conflicted and dislocated society in South Africa. Uh, I had the benefits as a young white boy growing up in the 90s. I benefited from what apartheid offered in the 1970s and 1980s in that sense. Yet when I went into high school, it was the first year that what were known as government schools were integrated for the first time. So this
Yeah,
idea of diversity started to
yeah,
become a little bit more real for me.
yeah,
I often say I started high school under one government, under one flag, under one national anthem, and I finished high school just 5 years later under a democratically elected government, under a different flag, under a different national anthem, under a different constitution, with a very different identity. And
right.
I think that that level of tension in a
Mm,
society, and that level of diversity is, for me, has always been the bedrock of have always
Right.
been the conditions rather for creativity to emerge.
Yeah.
I think
Right.
it's where homogeny exists that creativity is unnecessary.
Right.
If that makes sense, right? Where there
Yeah.
is tension
Yeah.
and when there is diversity, and when there is seemingly 20 different answers to the same question, that
Right.
forces a different conversation
Right.
around what a
Right.
potential solution to a problem is. And I think if you take the ambition coupled to that, and you
Yeah.
pair those two things up, that for me has always been the jet fuel that has propelled South African creativity onto the world stage.
Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Wow. Wow. I I over the months of having this podcast, I've spoken to, as you can imagine, CMOs and marketing
Yeah,
leaders across the
I've
continent.
watched most of them, by the way.
Oh wow, I appreciate that. I really do.
Yeah,
So I really, you have no idea when I hear someone of your, like, status and level say that you watch like you that's music to my ear. So thank you very much.
that's a pleasure.
Um,
Interviewed some of my
yeah,
favorite people in the industry, so it's been very easy.
fantastic. Fantastic, fantastic. So, in my conversations with the South African marketing leaders and CMOs, I have to tell
Mm,
you, this word ambition
mm,
um, continues to reoccur. And in
mm,
my mind, is that if that's how, majority of the marketing leaders and CMOs from South Africa feel, because I mean, you are saying the same thing now in terms of ambition being one of
mm,
the driving force. There's
mm,
no
mm.
surprise why you will not like push the envelope and just do
Sure,
and go over and beyond.
sure,
There's no telling
sure,
why you wouldn't
totally.
do that. I mean, when you say that your ambition was to be the best agency in the world, who, forgive my French, who the hell are you, from that corner of Africa,
Totally,
to say
totally,
that you do, you know what I mean? And I think that
totally.
really,
Yeah.
like you said, it forms a very different frame of mind, in
Mm,
terms of the kind of quality of work you want to put out, the
mm.
quality of people you want to bring in, the
100%.
quality of clients you want to work
100%.
with. So it's no surprise at all. It's no surprise. I'm sure that across all of the rest of the regions, some of the other regions where I've had the opportunity to work, work with clients or whatever,
Yeah.
I have to say, I don't want to call out any region before
No, all
they
good.
come for me. But
You can tell me afterwards.
some of my some of my closer neighbors here, are known for their, just their chilled vibe of, whatever
Yeah.
will be. There's no need to lose sleep over this. Let's just do what, and just, definitely the outcome is going to justify that input, like you were saying earlier. So
Yeah.
it's not a surprise at all. It's not a surprise at all. I want to talk to you about disruption as well,
Mm,
because you were saying something about a tension, that
mm,
the kind of tension that exists in the market in South Africa,
mm.
and how that can foster, wanting to, to be the best at what you do. I want to talk
Yeah.
about that tension in the context of disruption. I
Mm,
mean, specifically again for you being the group CEO of TBWA, and
mm,
disruption really is your, is your keyword.
mm.
What does that mean today? You know, especially when you look at everything that's happened over the last 5 years, 10 years, what's happening
Yeah.
today, technology, consumers, everything. There's this speed of change, this speed of evolution. And I'm
Mm,
curious that for TBWA and for you, Luca, what
mm.
does disruption mean, to you in today's marketing context, and
Yeah.
how can brands and agencies effectively implement or drive that sort of mindset within their organization?
Mm. It's a great question. So, I mean, for me, it's a bit of a full circle moment, right? For me, in
Right.
terms of disruption as it relates to TBWA and our what is essentially our sort of founding philosophy, as it relates to disruption. As disruption was originally conceived, it was more so than it was in part a strategic framework around how we believe brands will win within categories in order to win what
Right.
we say sort of an unfair share of the future. Um,
Right.
and it became sort of outside of a strategic framework, it became almost like a governing philosophy in terms of how we as TBWA people, we call ourselves pirates, navigate the world, right? And certainly
Mm.
navigate some of the challenges that confront our clients. So
Mm.
disruption, as it was conceived originally, was conceived very much within that context. Little
Mm.
could we know just to what extent the world would be disrupted um, on
Right.
an ongoing basis, right? It
Right.
feels like the word disruption I'm glad we coined it and trademarked it for ourselves 20, 30 years ago, because it feels like one of the most overtraded words at
Yeah.
the moment, right?
Yeah.
You're hearing it as CEOs are talking about markets, you're hearing it as individuals are talking about their own lives and how they navigate, the complexity of personal life and work life at the moment. And we
Right.
feel like as a people that the world is in a constant state of disruption. Our lives are constantly being disrupted. Certainly, the advent of new technologies has played a massive role in terms of
Right.
how human beings navigate the world, and therefore how they navigate brands and consumer products, so to speak. And that in turn has also informed how brands are engaging with consumers.
Yeah.
But why I said it feels like a full circle moment is that as technology has become more widespread, as we are grappling with, I suppose, to some extent, with this dichotomy between work from home, work from the office, as technology has become far more of a lens through which we view the world,
Right.
through our computer screens, through our phone screens, all through common platforms. Now, with the rapid rise, advent, and adoption of AI, it feels like through all of this disruption, an immense amount of homogeny has set in again, as I suppose our respective diversity of thinking, the aperture for that, I fundamentally believe has narrowed as we all look into the same places and spaces for inspiration.
Right.
As you mentioned, I got into the industry 25 or so years ago. We had a particular view that the best place to view the world was being out in the world. And
Right.
if BP was one of my first clients, if I wanted to understand what it was like to pump fuel, if I wanted to understand what it was like to serve a pie out of the BP Express shop, I had to be in the BP Express shop serving a
Yeah.
pie. I had to
Yeah.
be pumping fuel. I had to be delivering gas.
Yeah.
Now we don't do that anymore. So the diversity
Mm.
of experiences
Mm.
has narrowed so fundamentally, so that it's my belief, and it's our emerging belief that we're entering a new era of dull, right? So while we've got
Mm.
all of the technology at our fingertips, we are enabled to a to exponentially greater extent than any generation has come before us. It's resulting in more dull, less impactful work. And I'd say
Interesting.
that for me, that is a global problem, and I'm seeing it in a South African context too. So that full circle moment is, what are we doing again to return to disruption as a strategic framework? What are
Right.
we doing to take disruption enabled by technology and AI again to make sure that we're winning an unfair share of the future for our
Right.
clients and for our brands? So, as with so many things, in my view, so many of the basic fundamentals of what we do remain in place, but the tools and what we have at our disposal, it changes that. But we should never forget the very basics and the very fundamentals.
Mm.
So for me,
Right.
disruption exists both as a lived state out in the world, but for us very specifically as on a view in the world in terms of how brands should be engaging with categories and consumers.
You have this I listened to one of your keynotes, and you were talking about this concept of chaos, And I found it pretty interesting. And I said I was going to ask you on the podcast, like, what on this concept of chaos and in the way you talked about it. I mean, I watched that particular clip because again, it wasn't a long time. It was about 17 minutes or so. So I watched it a number of times.
Yeah.
So, but for those who haven't heard that, what are you proposing with this concept of chaos?
So what I'm proposing or what I'm suggesting is that in my experience, creativity has always emerged. I referenced it earlier. Has always emerged from environments which embrace certain tensions, right? And that homogeny in thought, it eliminates the need for creativity to emerge. So, advertising agencies, for time in memoriam, have been diverse environments that have sought to bring diverse people into that environment. And I say that, you know, in the broadest definition of that word, people who just see the world slightly differently. It's always been a place for agencies have always been the place for the people who couldn't find a home in any other environment because they just an inability to conform was just something that was so fundamental to who they were. So agencies have always been environments that have embraced certain tensions, and to a large extent embrace certain levels of conflict, and sought to to synthesize that with creativity being the output, right? So it's my fundamental belief. It's where these tensions collide within an agency that set the appropriate conditions for creativity. And you know, I was at a Design in Darba talk, and I think you may find it on YouTube, that Dan Wyden gave. And it's amazing how one processes with something that somebody said, because for as long as I can remember, I've been quoting Dan Wyden about something that he said. And when I went back and I rewatched the clip, I realized he didn't say that at all right? But certainly that's what I heard. But he said it's far more articulately than I ever could. But what he did was he suggested a similar thing, and that may well have landed for me very specifically in that moment, was that he said that he always felt that his agency was at its best when it was operating on the edge of chaos, like on the right side of it, but on the edge of chaos, when there was a bristle within the agency, when there was an energy that galvanized that entire environment, that was embracing of diverse thought, that was embracing of these tensions, and didn't seek to eliminate tensions out of their environment. And for me, the agencies that I've worked in, when they've produced their best work, has always been when there's that kind of energy within the environment. And I think that we too quickly, and tensions and chaos can be dimensionalized 1,000 different ways, right? I think that there are destructive manifestations of it, and there are constructive manifestations of it. I'm not suggesting embrace it as it manifests across all.
Absolutely.
Eliminate the ones that are toxic, eliminate the ones that are destructive, but also acknowledge that there's a double-edged sword to some that need to be synthesized and harnessed. And I believe that when you put enough of those kinds of people in the right room, the best solutions inevitably emerge. And some of the best pieces of work that I've ever been a part of have been born out of those kinds of environments and cultures. So I'm a big believer in it, a very big believer in it.
Yeah, I think in a very small way for me, like my experience with that has been just in terms of the personalities that, you know, you bring onto the team. I remember at one time when I was leading an agency, we had, you know, an art director by day and photographer by night.
Yeah.
We had an account director by day and a food blogger by night. We had a graphic designer by day and a music artist by night. We
Yeah.
had like it was this diverse,
Amazing.
like,
Brilliant. Yeah.
and I dare say that that was very instrumental to some of the successes that we saw at the time within the market. So I by a long shot, I subscribe to this suggestion.
I love that. And I think, what I was mentioning earlier around having a narrowed view on the world, and particularly through social media platforms primarily, where the algorithms feed us more of what it thinks we need to see, or more that we've already seen. It we're it's creating these echo chambers, it's creating these bubbles where
Yeah,
our opinion
yeah,
is constantly being reinforced. So we're not being
yeah,
challenged. And
yeah,
I think that it's only when we're challenged, that we're forced, as uncomfortable as that is, and we're forced to think differently. Human nature is such that we enjoy comfort. Right? We like a warm bath. We like a warm hug. We like things that feel like that. We like
yeah,
a
yeah,
workplace that is free of tension. We
yeah,
like for our opinion to be agreed with every single time. We like every
yeah,
idea we propose to be told that is the best idea they've ever heard. And that's awesome. But the problem
mm,
is, you're not going to be the agency that produces the best thinking and the best work, because that can only
absolutely,
emerge from
absolutely,
environments where there is challenge, where there is a certain where the issues are confronted, are debated, are torn apart into 1,000 different pieces and reassembled in ways that nobody entering that room could have ever imagined.
yeah,
So
we're-
I love your story about people who,
yeah,
even in themselves,
yeah,
bring different personas and bring different
absolutely,
diverse experiences into the room. So I
absolutely.
buy that 100%.
Absolutely. I wanted to also talk to you about, this collective of companies or expertise that you have within TBWA.
Mm,
And obviously same thing applies
mm,
to, companies who have similar structures, whether in South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, whatever.
mm,
And my question was going to be, how do you how do you foster a truly collaborative environment across these
mm,
companies? And the reason I'm
mm,
asking, for example, is when you get a brief that clearly
mm,
requires this roster of skill sets
mm,
that are
mm,
distributed across these companies, how do you
mm.
drive that collaboration? And this is one of those questions where I'd really like, like sort of like practical ways, because it's not the first time you would have agency groups or collective or networks,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I feel like sometimes that structure only exists on the presentation decks. You get what I mean?
Mm,
And when it comes to actual execution on a campaign or a project on a brief,
mm,
it's not as
mm,
seamless as
mm,
sometimes it's intended to be. So I wanted to hear
mm.
from you. How have you been able to truly galvanize every company or expertise within your collective, especially when it has to cater to a specific client or brief?
Sure. Sure. I mean, I suppose just firstly, the big disclaimer is that nothing I'm going to tell you is rocket science, and
Absolutely.
nothing I'm going to tell you is probably going to be a massive revelation, as so little in our industry truly is. Right. I think, as I said, so many fundamentals, the fundamentals that have been in place forever are the fundamentals that are applied today.
Yeah.
So for us, I suppose it comes from two things. Um, Firstly, if I look at our global organization as TBWA worldwide, we have a fundamental belief in the power of the collective. So and words are important, right? Because words determine understanding, and understanding determines how people engage with that thought, and how they navigate themselves and their businesses. And this idea of collective is that we are part of something bigger, but we're not necessarily beholden to it. We're all equal contributors to this organization. And as I mentioned to you off camera, Troy had always spoken about TBWA is not about New York out; it's about the world in. right? And that we are a collective of entrepreneur-driven agencies founded on a principle of what disruption is, governed by a set of behaviors that inform how we navigate the world. So culturally, that is very central to our global philosophy. Locally, what that means for us practically, and this is where it really is no rocket science, is you have to get everybody to believe in it. Yeah, everybody has to buy into it. Collaboration is about wanting to collaborate. People have to want to do it or not, right? And if they don't, then it's simply not going to work. You can force people into the same room, but you can't force them to engage meaningfully with each other in a way that is hopefully constructive.
Right.
So for us, one of the bedrock, first and foremost, has been to establish a common set of values and a common sense of identity of what it means to be part of TBWA. So that was the first thing. The second thing was for everybody to understand where we previously come from a set of companies within a group in South Africa that oftentimes were set up against each other, and a very strong sense of feudalism existed between these teams. Was for everybody to realize that their individual successes that related to themselves personally or to the agency that they were leading or the team that they were leading was inextricably linked to the collective success, right? So eliminate this idea that I can only succeed if somebody else fails. This idea that I will succeed if they succeed. They will succeed if I succeed. Is a far more virtuous energy within the organization. And then practically after that is to shine a light on and celebrate the behaviors that are required in order to create that in order to foster that, I suppose, a more sustainable energy within the organization. So where somebody is manifesting those behaviors, call it out. Say, look at this. Shine a light on it. Shine a light on successes. Create the use cases that create the belief that what you're doing can only be, that what we hope to achieve can only be achieved if we're doing it together. And I think what that does is it eliminates a sense of self in terms of the responsibility I have for my own business, and it suggests that you are able to impact more broadly and you're able to enable somebody else's success. And imagine if we had an organization of 550 people working to enable your success, how successful you would be. Right. So that's, I suppose, those are the more philosophical, the more philosophical approach to how we've managed to do it. And then obviously that needs to be supported by financial and commercial frameworks that both enable the individual agencies to go off and succeed, but to ensure that I suppose the requisite reward and incentive exists across the entire organization. You can't operate on philosophy and principle alone, but not support that with infrastructure that enables that, right? So we've worked really, really hard to create that kind of infrastructure and to ensure that we really live this idea of collective in South Africa. And also to go, you know what, it's okay for us to be a little different. It's okay for Grid to be a little different to Huntler Scars. It's okay for TBWA, our Durban office, to be a little different from Huntler Scars. It's okay for Magna Carta to be its own version of TBWA. We don't, as I said earlier, homogeny is it doesn't create the conditions for creativity. So why must I seek to create homogeny in my own organization?
Exactly.
We allow the leaders to imprint their own distinct approach to leadership on their teams, as long as it's aligned to our core set of values, as long as it's aligned to our broader purpose as an organization. Bring yourself, man. Bring your unique leadership style. It's the only way we'll attract the best leaders into our organization and bring fulfillment. There's a reason why the best entrepreneurs who start agencies and sell their agencies get the hell out as soon as the earnout is either achieved or it's very clear that the earnout is not going to be achieved, right?
Right.
But TBWA is an environment which has somehow managed to keep the entrepreneurs locked into their agencies and not locked in with handcuffs, but like they're there because we create the conditions that they still find fulfillment in their daily endeavors. And I think that it's that duality that we
Yeah.
work really, 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 really hard to maintain. And I think that has been party to some of our success in our ability to integrate these diverse companies and disciplines. Does that mean that it's done and it's easy and we've cracked
Of
a
course,
code?
of
Like, no,
course. Yeah.
it requires constant effort. Much
Yeah.
like any relationship, because that's what this thing is. It's a relationship
Yeah.
between individuals. Whether you're in your relationship in your personal life with a parent or with a sibling or with a loved one, we know that these things require ongoing effort. It requires constant finger on the pulse of where that relationship is at and what behaviors need to adjust in order to maintain a healthy sense of symbiosis between
Right.
these two entities, and that symbiosis has to exist within our organization too, as it is a
Yeah.
living. It is we don't have machines that print something. We don't have machines that we don't produce a product where the human experience is not a fundamental part of. We are owning a business of 550 to 600 people, and that in and of itself creates a living organization, a living organism, and I think it needs to be treated as such.
Yeah. Wow. I think that one of the things very clear to me in terms of just talking to you now and seeing some of the things in terms of my research and what I've known of your company, it's clear that culture is seen as a competitive advantage.
Mm,
Like if we get culture right internally,
mm,
it's going to take us really, really far. And
mm,
even just kind of deducing from some of the things you're saying is that, um, whether intentionally or otherwise, is that you see culture as a competitive advantage. Is that part of the reason these entrepreneurs or these owners or that
mhm,
you've described earlier remain within the business is also a large part. Most of the things we talked about just now is also from a cultural standpoint within the companies. And one of the
100%.
things I heard you talk about was, I think you called it, a clown in the head and a love in the heart, something like that.
Mhm, mhm.
And I found it really interesting. It's, again, like, I guess you have a thing for, this for capturing,
Yeah.
these narratives in some catchphrases. For those who don't know what we mean by, a clown in the head and a love in the heart, what does that mean? What does that mean?
So I wish I could claim that one as my own. I'd heard that originally um, from a gentleman by the name of Bob Rightford, who was the founder of what was Rightford Silk Maker, which became Ogilvy and made the Rightford Silk Maker, Ogilvy South Africa as it is today. And there was a very famous story of him being quite taken by a French rugby player by the name of Jean-Pierre Rive, who played in the 1970s and 1980s, and he wrote Jean a letter asking him what his approach to rugby and to life was, and he said I play with a clown in the head and a love in the heart, and I've never been able to actually find that quote anywhere online, so I have to take Bob's word for it and just assume that it was never something that he said that he published broadly. But I loved
Yeah,
it.
like
Like I
in the
absolutely
case of
loved it.
Dan Wyden, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I loved it because what it suggested is that what we do, it has to come from a love in the heart, right? You have to love what we do. Advertising, and when I say advertising, it's not a word I'm ashamed of. You find a lot of advertising practitioners trying to um, disassociate themselves with that word, and I think that's wrong. They can disassociate themselves with a definition of the word, but I've always seen advertising as every brand action as it exists in the world, not just in
Right,
the traditional advertising sense. I think it
right,
can only be done if you truly love what you do. Um,
right.
all of the things that we were speaking about earlier around the conditions for creativity, that stuff is hard. It's
Yeah.
hard. It's hard
Yeah.
to have your idea bombed. It's hard to invest so much and in a thought, in an idea, in a strategy, in a brand, only to have that thing fail and to have to go back to the drawing board. You have to be motivated by something other than just waking up, going to work, getting your paycheck, and coming home, right? So
Right.
a love in the heart is for me is everything. But the clown in the head suggests that we have to have a little bit of fun doing it, because
Right.
creativity is only accessed when we are in a place of abundance and a place of joy, right?
Mm,
And I think if
mm,
we can create the kind
mm,
of environment
mm.
that both creates enjoyment and fun and fulfills one's deep vocational need, I would even go as far as saying to create something that has impact in the world.
Right.
That is the kind of environment and the kind of culture, to use your word that you mentioned earlier, that we have to be creating, right? And
Right.
I often speak, and again, I probably stole this from somebody else, but I speak about, I don't really care if how long people choose to work for TBWA or in the old days at Ogilvy, during my time. I don't care if you're at the agency for 6 months, a year, or 10 years. People have, they with a place for a season, a reason, or a lifetime, as somebody once
Yeah.
said to me, and that's
Yeah.
fine. People don't have to do all the most work that they've ever done with our agency. The thing I care about the most is that they do their best work when they're with
Right.
us, right?
Right.
And that is both on them and on us. It's
Yes.
our responsibility to make sure that we set the conditions and create the environment for them to produce their best thinking and their best work. And it's on them to access the God-given talent that they've been given,
Right.
and bring
Right.
that to bear on helping solve any one of the client challenges and issues that we're confronting as it relates to their brands. So for me, a clown in the head and a love in the heart really sort of speaks directly into that. And and I suppose personally, because we navigate the world as individuals, I'm still in this game because I still feel that personally. I still feel
Right.
that I'm in an
Right.
environment where
Right.
that is a real thing, right? And
Right.
I'm still in this industry because I believe I can help create that kind of environment for other people. And hopefully that is the kind of environment where they find sort of a deep sense of personal fulfillment through the endeavor of creating.
Fantastic. Fantastic. By the way, I mean, I'm also adopting that phrase,
Good man.
I the philosophy of it's not strange, it's not new. I just love the way, it was captured, and
Mm,
it's definitely going to be showing up in some of my internal slides for sure. I
awesome.
wanted to, as
Awesome.
we start to wind this up, because I know that I've taken enough of your time.
No
Um,
stress.
when I think about client and agency partnerships, and I say
Mm,
partnerships intentionally because of the question I'm about to ask. When I look at whether it's Joe Public and NetBank, or when I look at
mm,
what you guys have done with MTN before they moved on to the new partner,
mm,
what I find really exciting is that what would you say were the core elements that drove or that drives such a remarkable partnership between the client and the
mm,
agency? Because I
mm,
think the experience is very, very different for a lot of people, if you get what I mean. Like,
mm,
some people leave agencies because of a certain client.
mm.
Clients leave agencies because that meme, what I ordered and what I got,
Yeah,
type
yeah,
situation. So for you, and just kind of using that case study, you don't have to. What do
yeah.
you think really drives those types of really remarkable client agency partnerships?
I think for me, in my sort of humble experience, and I've been very lucky to work across some incredible relationships. I mean, you mentioned the MTN one, but during my time and Ogilvy, South African breweries and Ogilvy had worked together for over 50 years at that point in time. Volkswagen and Ogilvy, 40 plus years. I'm very lucky within the world of TBWA that City Lodge has been a very long-standing client. Spa has been a client for 53 years this year, which is truly, truly remarkable.
Wow.
For me, it's always been about and it's going to sound sort of very cliched, but a deep sense of mutual respect. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is an acknowledgement of what each party brings to that partnership. I think that there has to be an acknowledgement and an appreciation for the respective roles in the partnership. And as I said, a respect for the perspective that each chooses to bring in. So again, back to that idea of diversity, that there are diverse skills, that hopefully a client comes to an agency because they feel that the agency is aligned on a common set of values. So their view on the world is common, yet they bring something which is not clearly and obviously apparent within that client organization. Right. So therefore the agency environment is additive. They bring something that is not obviously apparent, and then an embracing of that. Right. And I think as with any relationship, as we discussed sort of briefly earlier, a constant finger on the pulse of where the relationship is at, and a deep sense that no relationships will ever endure if they're neglected. No relationships will ever endure if they're taken for granted, and they just assume the other partner will just be there next year because they've always been there. So there is this, once upon a time, you used to speak about, wanting to create sort of we're not a one-night stand agency, we're the marriage agency. Right. Don't come to us for sort of a hot and sexy night and then expect, the next day we walk away from each other. But let's build something that is meaningful and that is unique. But that doesn't preclude that you have to work to keep it hot and sexy, right? I think that requires effort from both. And I think the client has to acknowledge that they need to take some responsibility for keeping this relationship vital, in the sense of like the blood flow is positive, and the agency needs to acknowledge beyond just optics that they need to be doing their part to create a sense of vitality in that relationship. So I think if one can get those few ingredients and behaviors right, no relationship should fall down. And of course, many relationships often do, for a whole host of reasons. And sometimes, again, to the reference to season, reason, lifetime, not all relationships are meant to endure forever. And that's okay, right? We have to be okay with that. And we have to be okay with the fact that some relationships, despite all the effort, run their course. And we have to be all right with that, and we have to be good to move on. I think that's a very adult and a very grown-up way of seeing sort of how client agency partnership should exist. And again, my frame of reference is always a personal one. Just apply the stuff that we've learned through our lives as human beings, right? Navigating life and navigating work, and apply some of those basic principles. And I think more often than not, you'll fall on the right side of things.
Wow, thank you. That definitely covered all of the bases. Some interesting thoughts there as well. I couldn't end this podcast without asking you, saying as you are a leader within the creative industry, with generative AI. I saw some sort of a case study of a beauty brand that posted something on LinkedIn saying they have this sort of annual promotional campaign that they do, and almost every year they spend about 1,000 to 2,000 euros on a photo shoot. And this year they decided to experiment with generative AI, and according to them, the quality of the imagery or the quality of the output was a lot better than what they would get from working with an agency.
Mm,
That's just one case study out of, whatever.
mm,
It's not to suggest that there's a bigger trend, especially for
mm,
big ticket clients. But I wanted to get your take on what are your thoughts on generative AI and its applications in the creative industry, or implications in the
mm,
creative industry, and how you as TBWA are currently navigating that.
mm. Wow, there's a lot of questions in that one, and this is like the hottest topic in our industry. So I'll do my best to be as succinct in responding to that
I
and as
saved I saved I
comprehensive
saved
at
the
the
best for
same time.
last. I saved the best for last.
I'm glad we've got some time still. So look, I think so there are a few things. I think in terms of the broader so my perspective on it, it is a fundamentally transformative technology that is going to change absolutely everything we do. Like that, and so that's the headline. The
Right.
the subhead is that we can't possibly conceive to what extent it's going to change things just yet. The technology is evolving so rapidly, um, and when AGI becomes a thing, and depending on who you're speaking to, that could be as soon as 5 years. It can be a couple of decades away. Which, for those that may be watching, AGI is kind of at the point at which technology overtakes sort of human cognitive power. Essentially, it can think like a human brain can think.
Right.
And right now, it's not there, as impressive as AI is. When I talk about sort of the breadth of I suppose the impact AI will have on us, it won't be purely on the generative AI on the output side. I think in terms of workflow, in terms of
Mhm.
processes, in terms of client
Right.
engagement,
Right.
it's going to be
Right.
something that is going to fundamentally change that. And we need to be not necessarily spending all of our time worried about what it's going to look like, but get going with getting going.
Right.
Starting to build AI into our systems, into our processes, starting to experiment with it, because otherwise we're just simply going to become completely overwhelmed. So,
Right.
as TBWA and as Omnicom Advertising Group globally, a multitude of AI innovation and platforms have been developed within each of the networks. And when I say networks, I mean TBWA, DVB,
Yeah.
BBDO,
Yeah.
etc.,
Yeah.
etc. And now what Omnicom Advertising Group is doing is taking the very best of those and aggregating those and sharing those across the entire collective. So it is immensely powerful, because we're able to aggregate an immense amount of work in the AI and technology space. Um, as TBWA, we have a platform called Collective AI, and that has a myriad of different AI tools as it relates to every single aspect of our business, even testing some of our ideas through an AI platform called BraveBot. We can input the ideas, and we call it BraveBot. Are you brave enough to input your ideas? That the AI will tell you if it's as innovative as you think it is. But it becomes, in that instance, it becomes a buddy, right? It becomes a buddy that you are bouncing ideas off of
Yeah.
constantly.
Yeah.
At the moment, for us right now, we're making sure that everybody is as skilled as they possibly can be on the platforms, and as the platforms evolve, we're making sure that our people are evolving in terms of how they use those platforms too. And in a completely oversimplistic way, where in the old days you would say, well, in an advertising agency, creativity is about art and copy. We're now going art copy machine, right? So we're augmenting what is currently there with the machine, and we're seeing what results are generated.
Interesting.
And it's been really great, right? And and why I said earlier, just get going with getting going, is that you with every question you answer for yourself, two or three new questions emerge, right? So you have to be prepared to go a little bit down the rabbit
Yeah.
hole on all of these things, and start playing, start experimenting. And it's incumbent on us that we're creating the environment where people feel like they can play and experiment, certainly within safe environments. We're very lucky with
Absolutely.
Omnicom that they've signed proprietary agreements with pretty much all of the platforms where we have enterprise versions that we can play in. So
Interesting.
all of our client data is safe, secure, and protected. We're not just taking client IP and sort of throwing
Yeah.
it out into
Yeah.
the universe,
Yeah.
which would be
Yeah.
super restless or reckless.
Absolutely.
The only thing I would say, the last thing I would say, and this as it relates to generative AI specifically, is, for me, creativity is always, and again, it's something that resonated with me, was this idea of logic and magic, right?
Right.
And it was something that sort of came out of the Cape Town agency that I ran. And the school that they founded, the Red and Yellow School, was sort of the art of logic and magic. And it was this idea that this relationship between the head and the stomach, right? And the stomach being sort of this fundamentally human brain that we are given, which is
Right.
informed by the sum total of experiences through our lives, right? So
Mm.
all the inputs, I suppose you could say, are synthesized by the brain, and then the tummy will feel whether something is right or wrong. And, we've
Right.
all been in a situation in our lives where we've been confronted with a choice, and
Yeah.
it hasn't felt right. But for
Mm.
all of the reasons that we've processed, we've done our to-do list, we've done our pros and cons, we've decided to go against our stomachs. And it's turned out to be the wrong decision because we
Yeah.
did not listen to our stomachs, right?
Yeah.
And that is a fundamentally human thing that can only be felt. I think so
Yeah.
much of our brain rests in our stomachs. And I think that if we can appreciate that, and if we can understand that, we will produce better thinking and better work in partnership with whatever platforms are developed and produced, and we'll produce work with soul, right? And I think, I have a passion for art. I studied art. As I mentioned, I was really pretty useless as an artist, but I have a passion for it, and I love it. And the best works of art, if anybody has ever observed art up close, some of the great works are works of art that have a soul, that a piece of the artist is existing either in the painting or in the marble or in the granite that they have carved that
Wow.
statue out of. And
Right.
Michelangelo, there was once a quote, and it was attributed to him rather, and they asked him in relation to some of his sculptures, like, how do you get to something so beautiful and so soulful? And he said, I start with a block of marble and I just take away everything that isn't the David. And I love that. I love that as a human approach for navigating
Yeah.
creativity, for having
Yeah.
a vision and understanding what choices you need to make. What do
Right.
you believe? What do you put to the side?
Mm.
And I think if we can synthesize this innate human intelligence um, together with what technology enables, will result in infinitely better thinking and infinitely better work. If we over rely on it, which is going to be the temptation, we're
Yeah.
going to end up with less than. We're going to end up with
Yeah.
work that is soulless. And I think that work that is soulless, it will never achieve the disproportionate impact that amazing work that has heart and humanity baked into the very center of it can ever achieve.
Wow. Oh man. That was
I
a
hope that made
perf-
sense.
that was a perfect no, that was a perfect answer, to be honest with you. I think that on many levels, with the many layers to not just the question but also your response as well, I think that there are clear, actionable things that people can take away in terms of how they should be approaching the technology, with the things that they need to keep in mind and look out for and aim for, today and going into the future. So I think I completely agree with you in terms of thinking of it as some sort of a co-pilot, on this journey that we are on, whether within the creative industries, more so within the creative industries
Yeah.
and any other industry as well.
Yeah.
Ah, man,
Yeah.
thank you very much, Luca. Thank you, thank you, thank you. I asked for an hour.
Awesome.
I've taken an hour 20.
Absolute
um,
pleasure. Absolute pleasure. It's
thank,
been a great chat, and I've really enjoyed spending the time with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I deeply, deeply appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Anytime.
I have no doubt that once we put this out, people are going to definitely find very useful and meaningful things to take away from it. I don't know if you have any last words. I typically like to end the podcast by asking the guest, what would you like to say to your 15-year-old Luca? In your case, that would be interesting, judging by what you're. Yeah, judging by what that was for you, you might want to tell 15-year-old Luca, relax.
It's so funny that the 15-year-old Luca, I mean, that's an interesting one because I was probably 15 years old when my English teacher in high school first showed us the can advertising reel, right? And that was where I first thought, this is I like that. Oh my gosh, look at this work. This is incredible. He just took it upon himself to put a VHS into the VHS recorder and wheel out the TV and play us what was then that year's can advertising reel. So it would have been from the early 90s. And I fell in love with this idea of working in the creative space. I think probably what I would say to myself is just believe that you can create a space for yourself within that industry, regardless of where you believe your personal limitations are. Let me sort of put it that way, right? Because we often are racked with the insecurity and self-doubt, and with me heading to art school and really questioning my own ability to exist in a creative world, I would just encourage myself to stay the course, because things will work out in the end.
Thank you very much, Luca. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you, and to you too.
I'll definitely be in touch. I'll send the links to you once they are published. Thank you so much, and I'll be in touch. Thank you very much, guys, for joining me on another episode of the Diary of a CMO. I thank you for listening as always. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. See you at work.